Hi folks, so since we are still snowed in like a week and a half later, I've been trying to think about ways that we could possibly catch up, and I figured one of the best ways to do this is for me to video record some of my lectures, at least some of the ones I would give in class, so we can try to get through this stuff faster. So hopefully you can see this and peruse it on your own time. So topic number one that I'm going to cover that I probably won't have time to cover in class is going to be the topic of populism. So this was largely question number 4 from your last essay quiz. And so I'm going to cover populist as of right now. All right. So as we moved into the period after the Civil War, a lot of farmers, especially those living in the Midwest, got increasingly fed up with what they basically felt was the government abusing them. And they basically felt like since government policy was laissez-faire and there was very little regulation of industries, that the industries, particularly those of the railroads, were taking advantage of the common men, and they wanted more regulation. And so as they became increasingly fed up with their marginalization by the federal government, they decided they needed to start to reform. Now, the first attempt at this was something called the Grange. And the Grange was an organization of farmers in the Midwest who really kind of organized themselves to the best of their ability by about 1875. And by 1875, they had over 1 million members in the Midwest. And they began more as a social group than anything else. And so these are guys who would get together at their swear dances. And they decided that they could more collectively organize themselves and be more effective if they got together in groups. And so they did things such as create co-ops, cooperatives, to buy things like farm machinery, or they got tired of having to sell their grain to middlemen. Remember, at this point in time, farm products was still our #1 export to Europe. And so they didn't want to sell their grain to one set of silos that then the middlemen would then sell to the railroads so they could get a rebate on sending or mass shipping products like this to market. And they started creating their own Grange silos. And so this way they felt they could better compete. The problem with this is that by the 1880s, they started to fall apart because they just couldn't compete with these railroads that were basically taking advantage of them. So by the time we get to the 1880s, these individual Granges started colluding together to create even larger co-ops known as farmers' alliances. And they replaced the Granges because they're more successful since they combined multiple co-ops in multiple towns, which kind of made them kind of sort of like corporations so they could better compete with the railroads. And eventually they decided that they could be more effective in their reform if they had more political power for themselves. And so by the 1880 election, all of these farmers' alliances became known as the People's Party, and they started to elect people on their local level to represent them better. Now, eventually, because this was a grassroots, so a bottom-up kind of movement, they became known as populists, therefore what was popular on the local level. And they basically advocated what these common farmers wanted. They also, as they started to gain power, in 1892, the Populists ran a guy named Weaver for president. They started to try to create a larger coalition of other people who wanted better regulation. And the other people who really wanted this regulation were industrial workers. And so a lot of these industrial workers who were worried about losing their jobs to immigrants, who were worried about working long hours in dangerous conditions for very little money, decided that maybe they should get involved with the populists as well, because overall business regulation would benefit everybody. And so by the 1892 election, their goals here, first of all, was to redistribute wealth and power, so take more power for the common men. Secondly, combine these lower classes, so these farmers, factory workers. They wanted more restriction of immigration, so there would be less competition for land and less competition for jobs. But they also wanted more direct democracy, and so a lot of these people felt that if they could have more power to suggest laws and have more power to enact reform, they could be a lot more successful in these things that they wanted to do. Now, eventually, they began to combine themselves even further, and eventually they ended up coming up with kind of a coherent platform for their party, and this was called the Ocala platform. And in this, these populists are going to try to combine themselves with these workers, with these angry farmers, but also with disaffected farmers in the South. And so they ended up getting together with the Colored Farmers National Alliance in the South to try to get the former freedmen to come and vote for them. And so out of the Ocala platform, the things they wanted to do, first off, they wanted to reduce the tariff. Keep in mind, farmers always hate tariffs because they're the ones who end up having to pay it for the most part. They want free silver. So if you think about that monetary policy, these farmers and these industrial workers are the ones that would benefit from an expansionist and inflationary monetary policy here, so for free silver. They wanted a one-term presidency, so the president didn't have to worry about re-election. He would just serve one 6-year term and do everything he promised to do. They wanted an income tax amendment to the Constitution. They want direct election of senators, an 8-hour workday, and kind of a more socialist flair to this, government ownership of railroads and telegraphs. And these policies began to get so much attention between the 1892 election and the 1896 election that by 1896 this becomes the high point of the populist movement, because the Republican Party basically ends up rejecting a lot of these ideas. The Democratic Party, they renominate Grover Cleveland, and the populists are going to create their own branch of the Democratic Party who gets the overall Democratic nomination in William Jennings Bryan. And so Bryan here basically ends up taking on the entire populist Ocala platform, and in particular the issue of free silver. So he's going to run entirely on this issue in the 1896 election, and he almost wins. Bryan argues for free silver and an easy money supply. He basically wanted this inflation to try to loosen the control of these New England bankers on the economy. And so he goes around the country giving what he called the Cross of Gold speech, saying that farmers basically are being crucified on a cross of gold. And a lot of these farmers really liked this. A lot of industrial workers felt this would benefit them. Business owners hated this idea. And so they're going to end up backing William McKinley. The problem with this is that it was really hard to keep this coalition together. And so here you have Western farmers trying to get along with industrial workers, and they kind of have competing interests. You also here see a certain level of racism involved, and so a lot of these populists didn't appreciate it when the party took on the Colored Farmers National Alliance in the South, and this ends up dividing populist farm voters. And a lot of Southern farmers didn't want to be in the same party as blacks. And so because of this, in the 1896 election, you see a resurgence in groups like the KKK trying to intimidate voters not to go to the polls. You also see a lot of these southern states passing grandfather clauses and the lynching rates increasing, trying to basically terrorize black voters from going to the polls. And ultimately, the coalition is not able to get enough votes, and the Republican Party ends up winning in 1896 with William McKinley. Now, this is basically the end of the official Populist Party, but at the same time, it also kind of shows a success in this, because after the 1896 election, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, in order to gain these votes, end up basically having to cater to these ideas. And so a lot of the Ocala platform ends up basically being incorporated into a lot of these parties, particularly the Democrats, but also the Republicans as well. And by the time we get to the turn of the 20th century, radicals such as Teddy Roosevelt are going to take these ideas, and this is going to end up morphing into the progressive period.